Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lawrence Singleton, Dean of the Lubin School of Business, and I'd like to welcome you to this Dean's Roundtable. I'm really honored to have with us today for the Roundtable Dennis T. Whalen, who is an 1982 alum of Pace University in Pleasantville, and he holds a BBA in International Business. He's a globally skilled business leader and financial expert shaped by a 38-year career with KPMG, serving leading companies across a variety of industries. He has significant industry experience in many areas, as I mentioned, including industrial manufacturing, where he has over 10 years serving GE in the United States and in Asia, in the energy space with Halliburton, Weatherford International, Koch Industries, among others, in engineering and construction with KBR and the Shaw Group, in healthcare with Pfizer and GE Healthcare. He's also highly skilled in managing and growing businesses, developing talent, and managing risk. In 2012, he was named partner in charge and executive director of KPMG's Audit Committee Institute, which is a major initiative inside the firm. He's the former leader of KPMG's Board Leadership Center and is recognized by the National Association of Corporate Directors, Directorship 100, as a leading governance professional. I'm really pleased that Mr. Whalen can be with us today. And I'd like to welcome him and give him a chance to tell everyone about his path to get here today. Dennis.
Well, thank you, Dean. And hello, all you students trying to squeeze this in between classes and maybe even between work and a little bit of life. It's a great opportunity to be able to chat with you guys today. Before I forget, I've got some comments that I'll share, and then I suspect we'll go into a little Q&A, and I've got some perspectives that I'd love to share. But I'm also 100% happy to pause at any time in the next hour and respond to any questions you have or things you guys want to talk about. The way I think about this is 60 minutes. That's all geared at getting you some insights that you may not get in your day-to-day activities. And I'm happy to answer anything that you throw at me in a candid way, in a constructive way, and based on, as Dean Singleton said, my 38 years at KPMG. So fire away, it's your Zoom is the way I look at this. As I was preparing a couple of remarks, I actually got a chill when I reflected back. I was at Pace University 41 years ago is probably when I started. And while I have gray hair, I'm different than a lot of people. I actually color the gray in so I look more distinguished and more mature. So when I hang out with a lot of board of directors, I want to fit in a little bit better. But inside, I'm kind of a 20-year-old. And you're all probably rolling your eyes because you don't believe that. I try that same line with my kids, and they just tell me, Dad, you really are old. Don't know how you got here, but you really are old. But that's okay. If you don't get old, then the alternative's not very good. So I'm happy to have been able to find my way through academics, work my way through a firm that I love dearly, learned a tremendous amount. And now that I've retired almost a year ago, my other than golfing 5 days a week, I'm always trying to figure out how can I give back? How can I share my experiences with folks and help them kind of navigate their own journeys? But 40 years ago, I consider Pace one of my first, or not one of my first game changer professionally, because it really, my 2.5 years at Pace set me up for what I think has just been a fabulous career, meeting lots of folks, dealing with different clients, working in different parts of the world and in the country. And I was on a different path. When I graduated high school, I thought I was going to be a fishery biologist. And, I went to school for a couple of years and I drifted through all of the sciences. And I found out that while I really liked fishing, I really didn't like sciences. And so I actually was a college dropout. And I remember the day I told my dad I wasn't going back to school. It was probably sometime in August I was supposed to be leaving to go back to my third year of college. And I said, hey, Dad, I'm not going to college. And his jaw hits the floor. And then he says, so what are you going to do? Well, I got good news, Dad. I got a job and it starts tomorrow and it's in New Hampshire. So I'm going to become a construction worker in New Hampshire. The good news is it at least got me out of the house. So I didn't have to, experience the daggers that I know his eyes were communicating to me. And I worked construction for 5 months to earn enough money to then head west with one of my former college roommates. And we skied for 5 months. And that was fun, but it was probably the 5 months that I needed to get out of my system and to kind of maybe grow up a little bit and avoid, everybody says, you got to do this, and then you got to do this, and you got to do this. And so I listened to him. I listened to the guidance counselors in high school that said, you like your aptitudes in sciences, so go do that. Go, link it with fishing because you got to have aptitude and passion. And so I went down this journey that fortunately I was able to pivot. Fortunately, my dad to this very day still talks to me. He calls me the kid from public high school who turned out to be relatively successful. He takes out the word relatively. I put relatively because there's a lot of successful people out there. And what I learned day in and day out, there's just so many different paths to be successful. And you've got to define success your own way, right? I'm one of those people who oftentimes will pick the path less traveled. And I think I've made a career doing that. But, like you guys, I was a fully engaged student by day. And by night, I was initially a cook. And then I eventually realized that the waiters and waitresses worked less hours and made more money because of tips. And so I became a waiter and waitress, a couple nights a week, and then, Saturday or Sunday. And I worked 40 hours a day in those restaurants. And that paid, part of my tuition, but all of my lifestyle. And clearly lifestyles back then are a little less expensive than they are today. I didn't get a cell phone for probably another 30 years, but that's a different story. But when I think about Pace and the professors, they pushed and prodded you. And some days you thought they were being really tough on you and being pain in the neck and didn't really understand what you were trying to accomplish at school. But what I learned in my 2.5 years at Pace, and probably learned even more in the next several years when I moved into KPMG, is they were preparing me to be a professional, to move me from being a kid, even a kid that worked and earned his own money, to somebody that could be able to be successful when he or she, in my case, he goes into a different world, in the world of public accounting. I remember when I first started at Pace, I'd done nothing but science classes for my first 2 years. I'm a junior by years out of high school, and I'm sitting in my first accounting program. And back then we didn't even have, laptops were an idea, or maybe not even an idea back then, but we used to have all these big spreadsheets. So you'd buy blank tablets of paper where you could do all your accounting and your books and records kind of stuff. And I'm sitting next to, I would call a kid, right? I was a mature, probably 19-year-old at the time. And I'm sitting next to a guy who's 17, but he graduated high school last year. And I guess in high school, he took an accounting class, which I hadn't in high school. And I didn't even know which way the page looked, because it was just a bunch of pages with lines and columns and all that kind of stuff. So the teachers, as I started to demonstrate an aptitude for accounting and critical thinking, I got friendly with a number of the teachers, and they started talking about this thing called the Big Eight. And I thought we had moved the conversation from academics and work to football. And I learned out that at the time there were 8 big firms that hired people that were going through accounting programs like I was at Pace. And this notion of those firms have CPAs, and what's a CPA? My dad did his own tax return, but he wasn't a CPA by any stretch of the imagination. And, over a short period of time with the nurturing I was getting at Pace University, I found my way into KPMG. I think back then it was Pete, Marwick, and Mitchell, and there were 7 other firms that kind of looked like us. And PACE was amazing. The professors prepared me for the job that I was about to embark on, and the career services group really were the ones that got me ready to engage with those kinds of firms, right? Resume. I couldn't even spell resume probably back then, but they helped me craft a resume. They helped me think about how do I go and interview with some folks, and how do I ask questions so I come across as articulate, engaging, thoughtful, and inquisitive, and all the things interviewers kind of look for in folks. And so those couple of years work out pretty well. I get a job with one of the big 8 firms. Now there's only 4. So it almost sounds like you guys are in trouble because there's only 50% of the employers out there. The good news is they've all tripled in size since then. So there's more job opportunities, even though there's only 4 firms. And what each and every one of those firms do today is so different than what they did, 30 years ago or 38 years ago when I started. So there's a tremendous opportunity. And I really think of them as they're another part of the educational system. I didn't expect to stay 38 years at KPMG. Like most of the people that start, everybody figures, well, I'll either stay 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. The 3 years gets you the experience you need to officially become a CPA. You get the academics, you pass the tests, you got to get experience. Some people stay a little bit longer to make manager and get some manager skills. And some people, for some reason, are willing to hang around for 10 years. I wasn't one of those ones who thought he was hanging around for 10 years. And up until maybe 10 years ago, I was one of those guys that would say, how can somebody stay at one firm for 30 years? Because at KPMG, 30 years is a big milestone. You get this Tiffany tray that has your name on it, and your the year you came into the firm and the year you made partner, and I still have it, but it's in a drawer in a box, and I don't think my kids have ever even seen it. But it's one of those milestones, and I would always reflect, how could somebody last 30 years and all of a sudden I'm getting my tray, right? And it is factually correct that I only had one employer my entire life, right? So that's a fact that I can't dispute. But when I look at KPMG, I worked in 8 different offices. I've worked on probably 25 different clients, and I had an opportunity to work internationally. I worked in Hong Kong for a couple of years. And the clients that are served at those large firms are just amazing. And I started in the Stamford, Connecticut office. And the reason I picked that versus New York was probably twofold. One is my dad, we lived in Westchester County, so we're about 50 miles north of Manhattan. My dad commuted into the city for his entire business life. And my dad would leave the house at 6 o'clock in the morning, and he'd get home at 7 o'clock at night. And he had a traditional 9-to-5 job. What I did know, or what I was expecting once I joined KPMG, is it wasn't a 9-to-5 job. It was more of a lifestyle than a job. And sometimes you left at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. If you got lucky, you left at 5 or 6 o'clock. And oftentimes you'd be working 12 hours when it's not busy, and 16 hours or 18 hours when it was really busy. And I didn't really back then have any desire to live in the city. And so I said, if I got a job that could be 12 or 16 hours a day, how can I add 3 or 4 hours of commuting on it? And then also when I looked at New York versus Connecticut, Stamford was a significantly smaller practice and office. But because of state income taxes, a lot of the major corporations moved from New York way back then to Connecticut. And so those corporations, because the CEOs didn't want to pay as much state tax, they all moved up. And in Stamford, I had an opportunity to work on Fortune 100 clients more so than even in New York, which is almost one of those things you say, how could that happen? But it did for me. I spent most of my first 5 years at KPMG on Xerox. And then, as Dean said, I spent 10 years working on GE. GE had moved from Schenectady, New York to Fairfield. So I worked a couple of years at the Fairfield headquarters. I got sucked into the GE admiration for Asia. This is in, the mid 90s. Jack Welch, who was the legendary CEO of GE, basically told his leadership team, if you're not in Asia and China specifically within the next 5 years, you will be out of business. So he moved virtually the entire organization over to Asia and China. I was working on that account. I was a relatively senior guy at the time, and an opportunity came up for somebody who looked like me, maybe a little bit older, maybe a few more years of experience, but the fact that I knew GE as well as anybody at KPMG did, I was asked, I was promoted to partner and asked to go over to Asia and work with our offices from India to Japan to Australia, and help them understand how to operate with a Fortune 500 company like GE. And so I went from almost overnight being a trained technical accountant to somebody who had to be a business leader. I spent more time with CEOs than controllers, more time with HR folks than accountants. And it really made me leverage the skills that I learned as a trained accountant, but convert them to a language that business leaders could understand and respect and make decisions off of. And so that couple of years working there really helped me hone my communication skills, and it helped me really understand the power of diversity and inclusion, right? I went from being a white guy in the US to being, a young white professional in China. I was the minority overnight, and I had to learn how to engage with people in a way that I hadn't had to learn when I was part of the majority. And so that experience helped me learn how to communicate, but more importantly, it helped me appreciate and respect the power and value of diversity and inclusion. So getting sent to Hong Kong was my second game changer, right? My first one was going to Pace. My next one was going to Hong Kong and having to convert from a trained accountant to a business leader, operating with, all of GE's 12 businesses in as big a territory and as diverse territory as you probably can find anywhere in the world. I would be in 3 countries a week, right? It was amazing. I would do the presentation between country A to country B. We had laptops by that point in time, and I'd be, modifying the presentation that I had, sometimes to KPMG senior partners, sometimes to the client. And my goal was to bring teams together, make them understand that they had more in common than they had differences, and make everybody understand how to work together and be successful. And I did that for 2 years, and it was absolutely fabulous. The real gem in that was I was married at the time, still married. I had a wife and 4 kids. The youngest, when we went to Hong Kong, was 6 months old. He doesn't remember any of it, though we lived in an apartment complex where there was grass outside of it, but you weren't supposed to walk on it. And so my wife would take the kids out for walks through the complex, and he would get loose from time to time and walk on the grass. And if my wife was there alone with him, the security people would say, no walking on the grass, basically. If I was out there, he'd be able to walk on the grass. But to this very day, and now he's 26 years old, he's 6'3", he doesn't like walking barefoot on grass. And I attribute that to his, first year and a half of life, or most of his first couple of years of life, living in Hong Kong and not being allowed to walk on the grass. I come back to Houston. I go back to the Stamford, Connecticut office. We actually moved back into the house that we left. We had rented it to my sister-in-law and her family. And lo and behold, in a couple months, my wife and I both realized that we changed. Surprise, surprise, right? You move to the other side of the world, and you do the things that I did professionally, and that my wife and I and the kids did as a family. And we kind of said, we don't fit in here anymore. The good news with KPMG, there's 85 offices in the US, and there's probably 200 offices around the world. So if you want to go somewhere else, there's lots of opportunities to do so. So lo and behold, I get a phone call from one of the partners that I used to work with. He's now a vice chairman in the firm, and he says, "Hey, there's a great job opportunity. You'd be a leader on a it's not a Fortune 100 company because it's private, but you'd be the leader of the account. There's some difficulties we've been having. It'd be perfect for your career development." And then he tells me it's in Wichita, Kansas. And I never knew where Wichita, Kansas was, but I knew it was in the middle of the country. And my wife always said, "Hey, I'll move wherever you want to, but we've got to be somewhere near water." So I go off to Wichita, Kansas to get interviewed by the client to learn a little bit more about the place. Knowing my wife's comments before I left, she said, "You can go anywhere you want, but we're not going to Wichita, Kansas." So when I'm out there, the interviews go fine. I really fall in love with the client and the people at the client. And I'm smart enough to spend some time with a real estate agent. And I told her, "You got to find me a place that has water." So we find a beautiful house next to a golf course on what I told my wife was a lake. What it really was a retention pond for the runoff water between the golf course and the development that we lived in. But 15 feet off our property line was a lake, and the kids could go fishing, and I could at least say, "Honey, I at least got you to water." The funniest part of that is 6 years later, when I get one of those phone calls again to go somewhere else, my wife says, "I don't want to move. We love it here." So the point in that, and it's part of my message to you guys, everybody's got to have a plan as to what they want to do in their lives, and what path you want to travel. But in my mind, or at least in my experiences, the journey I took, I had kind of like thoughts of where I wanted to go and things I wanted to do, but I didn't have it so narrowed down to do this and then do that. I was open to conversations about different opportunities. I promise you, in my first 13 years at KPMG, in my wildest imagination, I never thought I would move myself and my family to the other side of the world and work in Hong Kong. Turns out to be an absolute fabulous decision and a fabulous experience for me and my wife and my kids. Same thing in Wichita. It was the right thing at the right time. And part of what it credentialized, the client I went to serve was a company called Koch Industries, Koch with a K as opposed to Koch with a C. And lo and behold, they turned out at the time, they were the largest energy trader in the world and responsible for moving more crude oil around the world than any other company on the planet. And that brings me to probably the start of the next story. Enron, you guys have probably all heard of Enron in school, and Enron was this iconic company for some period of time. I guess they're still iconic now, but for different reasons and not good reasons. They meant all things to all people in the energy space, and unfortunately, they took some risks and did some things that took down that company and lots of other companies. And so they're starting to go in 2001 on a path to go out of business. Arthur Andersen are the auditors for Enron, and the catastrophe is so urgent, it also takes down Andersen, arguably for bad reasons. That Andersen gets sued by the Department of Justice, litigation happens, it takes 10 years, and Andersen, turns out Andersen wins the litigation, but it's too late because all the clients left. But because of that event, I get another phone call. "Hey, can you come down to Houston? You're our number one leading energy partner and Halliburton company, an oil field services company," which was Andersen's third largest client in terms of revenue in the country, are going out for bid for the audit. "We want you to lead the proposal." I was smart enough by this period of time, if you lead a proposal and you win, you didn't have to go do the work. So I knew, a victory was going to mean I have to explain to my wife that we're moving again and we're going to Houston. And the good news, what I told her is, from Wichita, even though it was a wonderful place, it was hard to get anywhere. And our family and friends still lived in New York. So from Wichita, we were doing well financially, but not well enough to have my own private jet. So we would have to fly through somewhere else. And that's just as a painful process with, 6 people with kids and luggage and all that kind of stuff. So Houston was bigger city, massive airport. You can get anywhere in the country and anywhere in the world was the story. And as my son, who was probably 9 years old at the time, one of my neighbors who had become my best buddy in Wichita said to him, he says, "So why do you want to move to Texas?" Right? Because he's trying to use my little son against me to keep me to stay. And my son looks at him, he's got blonde bangs and blue glasses, and he looks up to him and he says, "Well, I never lived there before. I'd like to try it." And so off go the Whalens to Texas. I work on the Halliburton account, which was just an amazing place. Dick Cheney was the CEO of Halliburton right before I got there. He had already gone back to Washington. I think he was the vice president at the time. So it was a company that had a heck of a reputation, an amazing brand, would take me to some countries that I would have never gone to, having served the other clients that I was in. And one specifically was Nigeria. I would go to Nigeria at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. And it took me to different markets. It took me into the Middle East, which when you serve GE and Xerox and PepsiCo, those aren't really markets that you have to spend that much time in. But if you're in the energy space, it's all about the Middle East, or significantly about the Middle East. So I would spend a tremendous amount of time in all of those countries. I got to see Dubai grow from relatively small country to what it is today. Saudi Arabia, Algeria. I didn't get to go to Libya. I almost got to go to Iraq when the first Gulf War was going, though my firm wouldn't let me go. But I was standing at the border next to a Marine in a 50 caliber machine gun in his hand at the gun turret. But that was as far as I can go. But you get to do lots of different things if your mind's open to try new things. And so, you know, when I look at all those client assignments, it got me to different places in the world. It got me to work with different cultures, which I find amazing and really valuable. It makes you really treat communication as an art form, as opposed to just, spouting words out. You really got to think about how the other side's going to receive them and translate them. And so those experiences I thought were really powerful. And when I put them all together, it allowed me to really move significantly higher at KPMG. I ran the Houston audit practice for about 7 years, which was, a $300 million business. We transitioned, Sarbanes-Oxley came out while I was running that business. So almost overnight, we doubled the business. When I took it over, it was about $100 million. When I left, it was $300 million. Driving all that change management, recruiting people, retaining people, developing people, helping them see some of the things that I could see. Like you, we're the same people. We just have different experiences, and how we kind of change and exchange our experiences is the way you build successful teams. It got me the opportunity to be elected to KPMG's board of directors, and I served on the board of directors for 5 years. I was the chairman or the chair of the audit and finance committee at KPMG. That got me to the assignment that Dean mentioned about the Audit Committee Institute. That then allowed me to say, hey, what are we missing when we're engaging with boards about governance? And if you're in the Audit Committee Institute, the only people that even want to talk to you are audit committee members. Well, a board has 10 people and 3 of them will be audit committee. That meant, since I was good at math because of my PACE training, that meant I wasn't engaging with 7 of the 10. That math didn't work out for me very well. And so we formed the Board Leadership Center and recruited some additional resources to kind of stretch the conversation and really talk about board governance and ESG and people and globalization and supply chains and all of those big, heavy topics. But we found that boards weren't having enough of the right conversations. They were going through lots of motions and, compliance-led, regulations-led, and we thought that we needed to get business conversations more into those board conversations. And then suddenly, just like the first day, all of a sudden I'm starting at KPMG. It's 38 years, and my last day was March 31 of 2020. So I retired right in the heart of the pandemic. So my last month with the firm, I was sitting in my office at home in Houston, Texas. All these fun parties that I thought I was going to go to for retirement parties, they got slowly canceled one by one. I don't even think Zoom existed in March of 2020. So we couldn't have Zoom retirement parties. I probably wouldn't have gone for that anyway, but now everything's a Zoom this and a Zoom that. So it was an amazing experience. It's all founded in my mind. If I boil down some of the things, you got to be the best you possibly can at whatever your core competency is. And so for me, I was a CPA, so I had to be an expert in being a CPA. And when I think about that in terms of you guys, the needs that I had to satisfy way back when are different than today for you guys. And for you, you got to be all over technology, right? People like me are afraid of technology. You guys got to embrace it. It's got to be about social awareness and social media and information that's flying around, and how do you boil all this noise into intelligent transmissions. And the last piece is it's data, right? The biggest problem that the business community has today is they have so much data and they're not really sure how to govern it and how to use it for good. And so you guys have to think in your transformation about, you got to be a trained accountant, but you got to think differently about technology. You've got to embrace social awareness, and you really got to think about data, because the machines are going to take over the data crunching, but the machines will not take over the human element, whether it's emotional or intellectual or analytical, in terms of how do you pull together the whole story. So those are some of the prepared things, Dean. And I don't know, we go to questions with you or some of the students, however you want to do the next part.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. Really, really appreciate it. Yeah, I would encourage the students to submit their questions via the chat, or you could even raise your hand and Mr. Whalen can call on you. I'd like to start by just asking a question. You said, I was going to ask you about how things have changed in the accounting profession over the years. You've talked a lot about technology and all that stuff. How has that affected the work that you do or you did until you retired from a risk management perspective? I'm sure there's been pretty dramatic changes, I would assume.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, right? It's you went from 80% of the effort was coming up with the analysis. Now that's all automated. So you've got to really manage how do you build tools. And in my KPMG experience, I was involved in building some tools. One of my clients went entirely on SAP. And so we undertook an initiative. If 100% of their revenues, and they had $32 billion of revenues, were all on a single instance of SAP, why don't I try to leverage that technology investment they made and put all of their data through some kind of audit tool that we would build and test 100% of it? And it took us 2.5 years to do it. But we ultimately, with the firm's support and muscle and my relationship with the client and access to that data, we built a tool that survived the PCAOB inspection, that automated the auditing of revenue. And until that point in time, we would use statistical sampling and test maybe 3% of the revenue and draw a conclusion about 100% of the revenue. This allowed us to test 100% of the revenue. So you took out risk of error, but you had to put a whole lot of protocol and structure in the development of those tools and making sure they were robust and not going to lead you down an incorrect path. And that brought us into a million different interfaces. We thought on this particular client, we really understood their technology systems. We learned so much as we were driving this new automation of auditing revenue. And, it was fabulous, the insights that we got out of that process. that we could share back to the with the client, and they actually, you know, changed a number of things. We found out, of all things, Argentina had a totally different model to the rest of the world in how they process revenue transactions. So they got to reconform Argentina to the rest of the free world. And then I'm pitching this at the audit committee. You know, I didn't hurt myself, patting myself and my team on the back with coming up with this new approach with the audit committee. And it didn't take 10 seconds after I finished the discussion with the audit committee for one of the audit committee members said, "Hey, Dennis, that's really cool. Thanks for doing that. So next year, since you can do it 100% of the revenue in 20% of the time, do we get an 80% cost savings on the audit fee?" And, you know, the CEO laughed, the CFO laughed, and I said, well, you know, somehow I got to recoup that investment I made over the last 3 years to embed that technology. And aren't you pleased that I'm providing more value to the audit back to you? So I guess I dodged the question and didn't really give them any fee decrease because, you know, you don't succeed long at firms like KPMG or any of the big four firms by giving back revenue, right? It's really hard to earn. Once you get it, you got to keep it.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. I'll let somebody else jump in and ask a question before I ask another one. So please put one in the chat or raise a hand if you have a question for Mr. Whalen.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing all that you've shared with us. I would actually like to ask you, you said you started as a technical accountant, and I'm guessing a lot of people did the same. They all started just like that. So what do you think you did different, or that you actually have something different than the rest of the people who were working at KPMG that actually led you to stay there for 30 years?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, you know, at cocktail partners over the years, or cocktail parties over the years, KPMG folks, you stand around, if you're talking to 8 KPMG people, there's 8 stories of how they got to where they got to. And more of the stories tend to be, I started in the New York office or the Stamford, Connecticut office, and I ended my career in that office. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I think the thing that charted a different path for me is, one is I started working with General Electric, which I thought was an amazing experience. It made me almost drool about going over to Asia with KPMG for an assignment because of what I saw GE doing and how it thought about the importance of China, particularly on the future of business. And then lo and behold, somebody asked me, hey, do you want to go? Right. And the partner who asked me, it was on a Friday afternoon, and it was because a senior partner at the last minute bailed out. I mean, that was the true part of the story, because he got mad at KPMG and GE in connection with a transaction that he was working on. And he says, I'm not going to the other side of the world if that's how they treat me. And so the partner says, hey, would you be interested in going? And he basically said, I'm pretty sure you're going to say no on Monday, but talk to Linda, think about it, and let me know on Monday. And, I called my wife on the drive home, and then we chatted a couple hours Friday night, virtually all of Saturday. My parents and her parents came and, said, please don't leave, right? We at the time, we're the only ones with grandkids. Don't take our grandkids to the other side of the world. What are you thinking about? And Sunday night, my wife and I made the decision, yeah, let's give it a try. And we didn't have a clue how hard it would be on some levels. But between the two of us, we said, hey, yeah, let's give it a try. We don't know what it's going to be, but, we heard wonderful things about Hong Kong. How bad could it be to live in, particularly with the firms paying all my costs, right? So I know Hong Kong at the time was probably one of the second or third most expensive places in the world to live. Somebody's going to pay my apartment. It was a 3-bedroom apartment. It was $13,000 a year, and it was only about 1,100 square feet. And somebody else was willing to pay the 1,300. So I was willing to live there and get to see a part of the world that I think was going to likely transform, the world that we lived in then, and clearly the impact of China today. And it was as simple as being open to an idea that would not have been in my personal roadmap if I was as smart as a number of my colleagues have been over the years, to write down the steps that they want to accomplish over some period of time. So that's why I tell people, embrace opportunities to do something different and take some risk, right? There was risk in going to the other side of the world. It could have been an amazing failure if I let it become a failure. And as it turned out, it was my game changer too. It let me leverage my skills as a trained accountant, but it helped me start to have a conversation with accounting as the language, but in a way that business leaders can understand it. And I use those skills to this very day. So be open to different things and be willing to take some risks, right? A great question, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, I'll jump in with another one as you're thinking. What other changes do you see coming in the careers of these students who are here with us today? If they graduate in the next 2 or 3 years and they decide they want to go into public accounting and maybe try to do the kinds of things that you do, what do you see coming down the pike for them?
Yeah, I think the opportunities today and tomorrow are even better than the ones that were there when I jumped into this career. Just look at those 4 firms. The wider range of services and products that they offer is just off the charts, right? It used to be pretty simple. It was, you could be an auditor, you could be a tax person. There was a little bit of consulting, right? And now, and technology wasn't part of the story. Now everything is built around technology platforms. It's all trying to distill social media information and sift, get intelligence out of all of the noise and the traffic flows, and use that to make more informed business decisions. Because what the successful companies and the more successful companies are doing a better data, capturing data and extracting value out of it, with the sole purpose, at least in my mind, is to de-risk business decisions. So it's that story that I used on the client, where we went from statistical sampling doing 3% of the revenue to 100%. I had no risk in whether revenue was right or wrong when I got to that 100%. It's the same thing with data analysis and data analytics. The challenge always is how do you capture it in an informed way that you can process it using technology, and the speed of technology is just off the charts. And so everything's about accessing data, converting it into information to make more informed and lower risk business decisions. And that will mean something different 6 months from now because of the speed of all of this change. We are clearly more global today than we were 40 years ago when this started for me. I don't see that changing at all. And I think that's a good thing, right? I think the world has more in common than they have differences. And I think together, as long as we can figure out how to get along and not go off to silly wars, I think we can solve lots of these global problems together, including things like ESG. We talked a little bit about it before. Whether you believe climate change is happening or not, something's going on. And if we can do it better together, you can't solve it if the US is the only one playing. You can't solve it if Germany and France are the only ones doing it. You got to get all of the major developed. And more importantly, you've got to get some of the undeveloped markets together, because Brazil and China and India, they're contributing mass amounts of pollutions into the atmosphere. And we could make the air over the US really, really pristine, but it's going to come from Brazil or China within the next couple hours. And so we've got to solve some things globally. And so I think that's the challenge. And I hope some of our politicians are up for that challenge. It's really important to the future of society.
I have a question. Hi, thanks for coming to PACE. I teach accounting at PACE. It's been 10 years. It's such a wonderful place. And
Wow.
this actually is the first time I'm attending Dean's Roundtable, because in the past it's always in person, and it's either on the day that I teach or on the day I'm not at school. So now it's like even more convenient. So I'm planning to keep, coming. I think it's amazing that we hear firsthand, like experience of all the people who graduate from PACE and have such a successful career. So that's very inspiring. And I have a question, like, we have a large group of undergrad students, and some of the students are very motivated. And I want to ask you, like, your story is so successful and inspiring, but what do you talk to the students who just started? How do you deal with challenges? And I'm sure there are some bumps along the way. I mean, especially at the beginning of your career, right? I mean,
Yeah.
what did you do to face all these challenges and overcome them and, step up?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? It's really hard to figure it out such that it works for everyone, right? So, and that's part of the problem, because if I'm talking to 50 people, 50 students in the room, or 50 first-year people, or third-year people, or 50-year people, they all come at it from a different perspective, right? Because their lives intersect with their work differently. And so you've got to have a conversation about balancing expectations. When I started, one of my early seniors, right? I'm a first 6 months at the firm. The senior seems to be, this really seasoned person. In this case, it was a he. He was 3 years older than me, but to me, it was like, oh my God, this guy's the smartest person I ever met. And back then, professional accounting or public accounting wasn't the kinder, gentler firm that it is today. And I'll say that tongue in cheek a little bit. I'll come back to it. But he used to say, if somebody'd be bold enough to ask a question, what time are we leaving today? Or on Friday, are we working Saturday? He would just say, put your head down and show me the bald spot, was his little joke. And basically it was, I'll tell you when you can lift your head up, and I'll tell you whether you have to work tomorrow or how long we're working tonight. And, 40 years ago, that was acceptable. The good news at KPMG and all of the other firms, it's not acceptable anymore. So my last major assignment, we'd have weekly meetings with the team, and we'd talk about, this week, the next week, and kind of a higher level view of the next month. So people could say, okay, we're only working 5 days this week. Isn't that cool? Or we're working 6 days this week, but because we're working 6 days a week this week, if you need to go do something for this half day, you go figure out how you bring your personal life in and make it work successfully. So it's about engaging in communications and sharing what has to happen, right? We're in a client service business. And so clients and our roles create requirements that have to be accomplished by the team. And so it's, how do we do that as a team? And how do we do it in a way that we're respectful of your personal situation, we're understanding of work-life balance, and we're trying to make something where as a team we can meet the goals of the whole team. And so in my mind, it's a conversation, and it's got to be open and candid both ways, right? And when I said earlier, tongue in cheek, it's a tough business to be in. Any client service business is a tough business. And so the expectation is it's not a 9-to-5 career, but you need to know when you really have to work hard and when you can go do some other things, right? You don't have to keep your head down until the boss tells you to raise your head. And it's all about balancing things over a period of time. What I would always tell people, the coaching that I would give, and I used to give it to myself, and it worked for me, so I'd start sharing it with others. Think about your career in a 100-day period. In 100 days, which is small enough that it's not so far out that you can't even wrap your mind around, could I stay another year? But 100 days, I would say, If in 100 days you didn't have more days that you enjoyed and more days where you learned something than days you hated or found unfulfilling, as long as you were answering the question in 100 days, I feel better than worse, then do another 100 days. If in 100 days you said, God, this is the worst thing in the world, first raise your hand and share that with somebody, and maybe somebody can change that. But if it can't be changed to your satisfaction, go do something else, right? There's all sorts of things to do in life that can be successful, because success is defined by the individual, not by the people around you. And so there's a lot of paths, and the paths that I shared, today is the path that worked for me. But boy, I don't know if I'd tell anybody else to take that exact same path. It just happened to work for me. But I know at KPMG, there's a million different paths. My only point is be great at what you do, love what you do, love the people you do it with, and be open for new ideas and, go do this or go do that. Because one of the things that I think is central to anybody who's been successful is to take some risk in an appropriate way and to stretch yourself in ways that you wouldn't normally want to, because that's where real learning and opportunities come from.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I have a final question, just to end it with some reminiscing. If you could tell us about your favorite PACE memory.
My favorite PACE memory. There was a professor, Professor Berman, and he taught. I took him for intermediate accounting, and he was known to be the career or degree breaker, right? If you could take those classes and pass with him, then you could pass anything with anybody. And I remember one test, I got a 99 on the test, and he took 1 point off from the grade because at the top of the sheet of paper, instead of spelling trial balance, I spelled trail balance. And initially it frustrated me because it was, 1 point. I wanted that perfect 100 score. And I thought he was being kind of a little bit of a jerk. And what I realized he taught, what he was telling me was, you really gotta be precise in this world of public accounting. And you've gotta review your own work, and you've gotta, you gotta go down a path that's thoughtful, and you always gotta go back over your work and double check some things. And so, it's kind of a weird story, but it's one that I always reflect on. And, losing that 1 point was probably worth its weight in gold. Professor Berman and Reisig and De Benedetto, they were the guys that I took all of my accounting classes. And, we actually became friends because they loved what I did, and I was thirsting for knowledge, and they were willing to help share their experiences with me in what I thought was a really good way, right? They taught me what was in the textbook, and they taught me what was out of the textbook. And together we went through something, and I stayed in contact with a number of them for like 10 years and then lost contact with all but one. There's one we still stay in contact because he lives in my hometown where my parents still live. But they really taught me about life as a journey, and learning is a really important aspect of it. So that would be my story.
That's a great story, no question about that. I laugh because I understand what trial balances are, as I guess all these students do as well.
I've kind of forgotten, for the record.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier about the world being so much smaller and international, everything. If students are going to start their career in public accounting, is there anything in particular you'd recommend they do now, or maybe when they start with the firm, to set themselves up for that kind of opportunity?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And yeah, I think there are some things, right? It's, I'm retired now a year. I play golf 5 days a week, but every day except Saturday, every day of the week, I spend the first 2 hours every day drinking a couple cups of coffee and watching some of the news, right? I'll watch CNN a little bit. I'll watch Fox News for a little bit. I'll watch CNBC a little bit. And then there's 4 or 5 daily periodical kinds of things that I get emails, and I read through that stuff. And the things that I collect, on a daily basis are very global in their nature, because I think it's really important to expand and think about the global world. One of them is Ian Bremmer, who runs this geopolitical group called Eurasia Group. And he talks about, he sends a weekly letter that's about a page and a half, and he goes around the world in his weekly letter. And then there's some daily things that are really targeted to a particular country. And so I would just say, immerse yourself in information about what's happening all over the world. You don't have to spend 10 hours a day. And since you guys are students and probably working too, spend 30 minutes a day reading a couple things that you wouldn't have read unless you were just trying to expose yourself to what's going on. And it's amazing how over a short period of time, you'll really start getting a sense for what's happening, whether it's the Middle East or China or Europe or the UK, because somehow in this interconnected world that we live in, what pops in country A will ultimately find itself in country B. And it's kind of gives you signals and early warnings that you got to start those conversations about here. If I think about some of the things that I wish I did, and when I was in Hong Kong, I started taking Mandarin lessons, but they were too hard. And I was, as I said, I was in 3 countries a week. Only one of those countries spoke Mandarin. So I gave that up. If you have a second language or don't have a second language, learning a second language would be, in my mind, amazing, because it would allow you to go into one of those, geographies, whether it's Chinese or Spanish. Pick something. It would be a nice skill set to add to your repertoire. And I think successful careers, what I'm really trying to say is, you need to differentiate yourself from the people you're sitting next to, because the different candidate usually gets the opportunities, right? If there's 10 candidates sitting outside somebody's office waiting to interview for a job, usually the one that's different, and whatever that means, is the one that gets the opportunity. So find your difference and get really good at it, and be passionate about what you do. So
that's great advice. There's time for one more quick question if anybody has anything to ask. If not, I really want to thank you for being with us here this afternoon. It's a real pleasure for me to meet you, and I know the students and everyone on the call feels the same way. We've got a gift to as a small token of our appreciation. Unfortunately, I can't hand it to you through the camera, so it'll be on the way to you in Houston soon. But it's a real pleasure to meet you, and I really want to thank you for taking time. You're a very successful alumnus of Pace University and the Lubin School of Business, and I appreciate you sharing your time with us.
Thank you. Dean, thank you, and it's great to meet you as well. And to all the students, good luck and enjoy. Be good.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a nice day, everybody.
Thank you.